Recorded Books Incorporated presents an unabridged recording of Myth Conceptions by Robert Asprin, narrated by Jeff Woodman. This work, copyrighted 1980 by Robert L. Asprin, is recorded by arrangement with Curtis Brown, Limited. This recording is copyrighted 1997 by Recorded Books Incorporated. Skeeve is just a magician's apprentice, and his mentor does his best to keep the kid out of trouble. Then along comes the chance of a lifetime, an audition at the court of Roderick V for the position of court magician. Unfortunately for everyone, Skeeve gets the job. And now, Myth Conceptions.
Chapter 1. Life is a series of rude awakenings. R. V. Winkle. Of all the various unpleasant ways to be aroused from a sound sleep, one of the worst is the noise of a dragon and a unicorn playing tag. I pried one eye open and blearily tried to focus on the room. A chair toppled noisily to the floor, convincing me the blurred images my mind was receiving were due, at least in part, to the irregular vibrations coming from the floor and walls. One without my vast storehouse of knowledge, hard-won and painfully endured, might be inclined to blame the pandemonium on an earthquake. I didn't. The logic behind this conclusion was simple. Earthquakes were extremely uncommon in this area. A dragon and a unicorn playing tag wasn't. It was starting out as an ordinary day. That is, ordinary if you're a junior magician apprenticed to a demon. If I had been able to predict the future with any degree of accuracy, and thus foresee the events to come, I probably would have stayed in bed. I mean, fighting has never been my forte, and the idea of taking on a whole army... But I'm getting ahead of myself. The thud that aroused me shook the building, accompanied by the crash of various dirty dishes shattering on the floor. The second thud was even more spectacular. I considered doing something. I considered going back to sleep. Then I remembered my mentor's condition when he had gone to bed the night before. That woke me up fast. The only thing nastier than a demon from Perv is a demon from Perv with a hangover. I was on my feet and headed for the door in a flash. My agility was a tribute more to my fear rather than to any inborn talent. Wrenching the door open, I thrust my head outside and surveyed the terrain. The grounds outside the inn seemed normal. The weeds were totally out of hand, more than chest-high in places. Something would have to be done about them someday, but my mentor didn't seem to mind their riotous growth, and since I was the logical candidate to cut them if I raised the point, I decided once again to keep silent on the subject. Instead, I studied the various flattened patches and newly torn paths in the overgrowth, trying to determine the location or at least the direction of my quarry's movement. I had almost convinced myself that the silence was at least semi-permanent, and it would be all right to go back to sleep, when the ground began to tremble again. I sighed and shakily drew myself up to my full height, what there was of it, and prepared to meet the onslaught. The unicorn was the first to come into view, great clumps of dirt flying from beneath his hooves as he ducked around the corner of the inn on my right. "Buttercup!" I shouted in my most authoritative tone. A split second later, I had to jump back into the shelter of the doorway to avoid being trampled by the speeding beast. Though a bit miffed at his disobedience, I didn't really blame him. He had a dragon chasing him, and dragons are not notoriously agile when it comes to quick stops. As if acting on a cue from my thoughts, the dragon burst into view. To be accurate, he didn't really burst. He thudded, shaking the inn as he rebounded off the corner. As I said, dragons are not notoriously agile. "Gleep!" I shouted. "Stop it this instant!" He responded by taking an affectionate swipe at me with his tail as he bounded past. Fortunately for me, the gesture went wide of its mark, hitting the inn with another jarring thud instead. So much for my most authoritative tone. If our two faithful charges were any more obedient, I'd be lucky to escape with my life. Still, I had to stop them. Whoever came up with the immortal quote about waking sleeping dragons had obviously never had to contend with a sleeping demon. I studied the two of them chasing each other through the weeds for a few moments, then decided to handle this the easy way. Closing my eyes, I envisioned both of them, the dragon and the unicorn. Then I superimposed the image of the dragon over that of the unicorn, fleshed it out with a few strokes of my mental paintbrush, then opened my eyes. To my eyes, the scene was the same, a dragon and a unicorn confronting each other in a field of weeds. But of course, I had cast the spell, so naturally I wouldn't be taken in. Its true effect could be read in Gleep's reaction. He cocked his head and peered at Buttercup, first from this angle, then that, stretching his long serpentine neck to its limits. Then he swiveled his head until he was looking backward, and repeated the process, scanning the surrounding weeds. Then he looked at Buttercup again. To his eyes, his playmate had suddenly disappeared, to be replaced by another dragon. It was all very confusing, and he wanted his playmate back. In my pet's defense, when I speak of his lack of agility, both physically and mentally, I don't mean to imply he is either clumsy or stupid. He's young, which also accounts for his mere 10-foot length and half-formed wings. I fully expect that when he matures, in another 400 or 500 years, he will be very deft and wise, which is more than I can say for myself. In the unlikely event I should live that long, all I'll be is old. Gleep! The dragon was looking at me now. Having stretched his limited mental abilities to their utmost, he turned to me to correct the situation, or at least provide an explanation. As the perpetrator of the situation causing his distress, I felt horribly guilty. For a moment, I wavered on the brink of restoring Buttercup's normal appearance. "If you're quite sure you're making enough noise—" I winced at the deep, sarcastic tones booming close behind me. All my efforts were for naught. Aahz was awake. I assumed my best hangdog attitude and turned to face him. Needless to say, he looked terrible. If perchance you think a demon covered with green scales already looks terrible, you've never encountered one with a hangover. The normal gold flecks in his yellow eyes were now copper, accented by a throbbing network of orange veins. His lips were drawn back in a painful grimace, which exposed even more of his pointed teeth than his frightening, reassuring smile. Looming there, his fists clenched on his hips, he presented a picture terrifying enough to make a spider bear faint. I wasn't frightened, however. I had been with Aahz for over a year now, and knew his bark was worse than his bite. Then again, he had never bitten me. "Gee, Aahz," I said, digging a small hole with my toe. "You're always telling me if I can't sleep through anything, I'm not really tired." He ignored the barb, as he so frequently does when I catch him on his own quotes. Instead, he squinted over my shoulder at the scene outside. "Kid," he said, "tell me you're practicing. Tell me you haven't really scrounged up another stupid dragon to make our lives miserable." "I'm practicing," I hastened to reassure him. To prove the point, I quickly restored Buttercup's normal appearance. "Gleep," said Gleep happily, and the two of them were off again. "Really, Aahz," I said innocently to head off his next caustic remark, "where would I find another dragon in this dimension?" "If there was one to be found here on Claw, you'd find it," he snarled. "As I recall, you didn't have that much trouble finding this one the first time I turned my back on you. Apprentices." He turned and retreated out of the sunlight into the dim interior of the inn. "If I recall," I commented, following him, "that was at the bazaar on Diva. I couldn't get another dragon there because you won't teach me how to travel through the dimensions." "Get off my case, kid," he moaned. "We've been over it 1,000 times. Dimension traveling is dangerous. Look at me, stranded without my powers in a back-assward dimension like Claw, with a lifestyle as barbaric and the food is disgusting." "You lost your powers because Garkin laced his special effects cauldron with that joke powder and then got killed before he could give you the antidote," I pointed out. "Watch how you talk about your old teacher," Aahz warned. "The old slime-monger was inclined to get carried away with practical jokes once in a while, true, but he was a master magician and a friend of mine. If he wasn't, I wouldn't have saddled myself with his mouthy apprentice," he finished, giving me a meaningful look. "I'm sorry, Aahz," I apologized. "It's just that I—" "Look, kid," he interrupted wearily, "if I had my powers, which I don't, and if you were ready to learn dimension hopping, which you aren't, we could give it a try. Then, if you miscalculated and dumped us into the wrong dimension, I could get our tails out before anything bad happened. As things stand, trying to teach you dimension hopping would be more dangerous than playing Russian roulette." "What's Russian?" I asked. The inn shook as Gleep missed the corner turn again. "When are you going to teach your stupid dragon to play on the other side of the road?" Aahz snarled, craning his neck to glare out a window. "I'm working on it, Aahz," I insisted soothingly. "Remember, it took me almost a whole year to housebreak him." "Don't remind me," Aahz grumbled. "If I had my way, we'd—" He broke off suddenly and cocked his head to one side. "You better disguise that dragon, kid," he announced suddenly, "and get ready to do your dubious character bit. We're about to have a visitor." I didn't contest the information. We had established long ago that Aahz's hearing was much more acute than mine. "Right, Aahz," I acknowledged, and hurried about my task. The trouble with using an inn for a base of operations, however abandoned or weather-beaten it might be, was that occasionally people would stop here seeking food and lodging. Magic was still outlawed in these lands, and the last thing we wanted was witnesses. Chapter 2. First impressions, being the longest lasting, are of utmost importance. J. Carter. Aahz and I had acquired the inn under rather dubious circumstances. Specifically, we claimed it as our rightful spoils of war after the two of us, with the assistance of a couple of allies now absent, had routed Istvan, a maniac magician, and sent him packing into far dimensions along with all his surviving accomplices. The inn had been Istvan's base of operations, but now it was ours. Who Istvan had gotten it from and how, I didn't want to know. Despite Aahz's constant assurances, I lived in dread of encountering the inn's rightful owner. I couldn't help remembering all this as I waited outside the inn for our visitor. As I said, Aahz has very good hearing. When he tells me he hears something close by, he frequently forgets to mention that close by may be over a mile away. I have also noted, over the course of our friendship, that his hearing is curiously erratic. He can hear a lizard bird scratching itself half a mile away, but occasionally seems unable to hear the politest of requests, no matter how loudly I shout them at him. There was still no sign of our rumored visitor. I considered moving back inside the inn, out of the late morning sun, but decided against it. I had carefully arranged the scene for our guest's arrival, and I hated to disrupt it for such a minor thing as personal comfort. I had used the disguise spell liberally on Buttercup, Gleep, and myself. Gleep now looked like a unicorn, a change that did not seem to bother Buttercup in the slightest. Apparently, unicorns are less discriminating about their playmates than are dragons. I had made them both considerably more disheveled and unkempt-looking than they actually were. This was necessary to maintain the image set forth by my own appearance. Aahz and I had decided early in our stay that the best way to handle unwanted guests was not to threaten them or frighten them away, but rather to be so repulsive that they left of their own accord. To this end, I had slowly devised a disguise designed to convince strangers they did not want to be in the same inn with me, no matter how large the inn was or how many other people were there. In this disguise, I would greet wayward travelers as the proprietor of the inn. Modestly, I will admit the disguise was a screaming success. In fact, that was the specific reaction many visitors had to it. Some screamed, some looked ill, others sketched various religious symbols in the air between themselves and me. None of them elected to spend the night. When I experimented with various physical defects, Aahz correctly pointed out that many people did not find any single defect revolting. In fact, in a dimension such as Kla, most would consider it normal. To guarantee the desired effect, I adopted many of them. When disguised, I walked with a painful limp, had a hump back, and a deformed hand which was noticeably diseased. What teeth remained were twisted and stained, and the focus of one of my eyes had a tendency to wander about independently of the other. My nose, in fact my entire face, was not symmetrical, and as a master stroke of my disguise abilities, there appeared to be vicious-looking bugs crawling about my mangy hair and tattered clothes. The overall effect was horrifying. Even Aahz admitted he found it disquieting, which, considering the things he's seen in his travels through the dimensions, was high praise indeed. My thoughts were interrupted as our visitor came into view. He sat ramrod straight astride a huge, flightless riding bird. He carried no visible weapons and wore no uniform, but his bearing marked him as a soldier much more than any outer trappings could have. His eyes were wary, constantly darting suspiciously about as he walked his bird up to the inn in slow, deliberate steps. Surprisingly enough, his gaze passed over me several times without registering my presence. Perhaps he didn't realize I was alive. I didn't like this. The man seemed more the hunter than the casual traveler. Still, he was here and had to be dealt with. I went into my act. "Does the noble sir require a room?" As I spoke, I moved forward in my practical rolling gait. In case the subtlety of my disguise escaped him, I allowed a large gob of spittle to ooze from the corner of my mouth where it rolled unhindered down to my chin. For a moment, the man's attention was occupied controlling his mount. Flightless or not, the bird was trying to take to the air. Apparently, my disguise had touched a primal chord in the bird's mind that went back prior to its flightless ancestry. I waited, head cocked curiously, while the man fought the bird to a fidgety standstill. Finally, he turned his attention to me for a moment. Then he averted his eyes and stared carefully at the sky. "I come seeking the one known as Skeeve the magician," he told me. Now it was my turn to jump. To the best of my knowledge, no one knew who I was and what I was, much less where I was, except for Aahz and me. "That's me," I blurted out, forgetting myself and using my real voice. The man turned horrified eyes on me, and I remembered my appearance. "That's me master," I amended hastily. "You wait, I fetch." I turned and scuttled hastily into the inn. Aahz was waiting inside. "What is it?" he demanded. He wants to talk to Skeeve. To me, I babbled nervously. So? He asked pointedly. What are you doing in here? Go outside and talk to the man. Looking like this? Aahz rolled his eyes at the ceiling in exasperation. Who cares what you look like? He barked. Come on, kid, the man's a total stranger. I care, I declared, drawing myself up haughtily. The man asked for Skeeve the magician, and I think— He what? Aahz interrupted. He asked for Skeeve the magician, I repeated, covertly studying the figure waiting outside. He looks like a soldier to me, I supplied. He looks scared to me, Aahz retorted. Maybe you should tone down your disguise a bit next time. Do you think he's a demon hunter? I asked nervously. Instead of answering my question, Aahz turned abruptly from the window. If he wants a magician, we'll give him a magician, he murmured. Quick, kid, slap the Garkin disguise on me. As I noted earlier, Garkin was my first magic instructor. An imposing figure with a salt-and-pepper beard, he was one of our favorite and most oft-used disguises. I could do Garkin in my sleep. Good enough, kid, Aahz commented, surveying the results of my work. Now follow close and let me do the talking. Like this? I exclaimed. Relax, kid, he reassured me. For this conversation, I'm you. Understand? Aahz was already heading out through the door without waiting for my reply, leaving me little choice other than to follow along behind him. Who seeks an audience with the great Skeeve? Aahz bellowed in a resonant bass voice. The man shot another nervous glance at me, then drew himself up in stiff formality. I come as an emissary from His Most Noble Majesty Roderick V, King of Possiltum, who— Where's Possiltum? Aahz interrupted. I beg your pardon. The man blinked. Possiltum, Aahz repeated. Where is it? Oh, the man said with sudden understanding. It's the kingdom just east of here. Other side of the Ember River. You can't miss it. Okay, Aahz nodded. Go on. The man took a deep breath, then hesitated, frowning. King of Possiltum? I prompted. Oh, yes, thanks. The man shot a quick smile, then another quick stare, then continued. King of Possiltum, who sends his respects and greetings to the one known as Skeeve the magician. He paused and looked at Aahz expectantly. He was rewarded with a polite nod of the head. Satisfied, the man continued. His Majesty extends an invitation to Skeeve the magician to appear before the court of Possiltum, that he might be reviewed for his suitability for the position of court magician. I don't really feel qualified to pass judgment on the king's suitability as a court magician, Aahz said modestly, eyeing the man carefully. Isn't he content just to be king? No, the man corrected hastily. The king wants to review your suitability. Oh, Aahz said with the appearance of sudden understanding. That's a different matter entirely. Well, an invitation from— Who was it again? Roderick V, the man announced, lifting his head haughtily. Well, Aahz said, grinning broadly, I've never been one to refuse a fifth. The man blinked and frowned, then glanced at me quizzically. I shrugged, not understanding the joke myself. You may tell His Majesty, Aahz continued, unaware of our confusion, I shall be happy to accept his kind invitation. I shall arrive at his court at my earliest convenience. The man frowned. I believe His Majesty requires your immediate presence, he commented darkly. Of course, Aahz answered smoothly. How silly of me. If you will accept our hospitality for the night, I and my assistant here will be most pleased to accompany you in the morning." I knew a cue when I heard one. I drooled and bared my teeth at the messenger. The man shot a horrified look in my direction. "Actually," he said hastily, "I really must be going. I'll tell His Majesty you'll be following close behind." "You're sure you wouldn't like to stay?" Aahz asked hopefully. "Positive." The man nearly shouted his reply as he began backing the bird away from us. "Oh well," Aahz said. "Perhaps we'll catch up with you on the road." "In that case," the man said, turning his bird, "I'll want a head... That is, I'd best be on my way to announce your coming." I raised my hand to wave goodbye, but he was already moving at a rapid pace, urging his mount to still greater speeds and ignoring me completely. "Excellent," Aahz exclaimed, rubbing his hands together gleefully. "A court magician! What a soft job! And the day started out so miserably." "If I can interrupt," I interrupted, "there's one minor flaw in your plan." What's that?" "I don't want to be a court magician." As usual, my protest didn't dampen his enthusiasm at all. "You didn't want to be a magician either," he reminded me bluntly. "You wanted to be a thief. Well, here's a good compromise for you. As a court magician, you'll be a civil servant, and civil servants are thieves on a grander scale than you ever dreamed possible." Chapter 3. 90% of any business transaction is selling yourself to the client. Ex-Hollander. "Now let me see if I've got this right," I said carefully. "You're saying they probably won't hire me on the basis of my abilities." I couldn't believe I'd interpreted Aahz's lecture correctly, but he beamed enthusiastically. "That's right, kid," he approved. "Now you've got it." "No, I don't," I insisted. "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard." Aahz groaned and hid his face in his hand. It had been like this ever since we left the inn, and 3 days of a demon's groaning is a bit much for anyone to take. "I'm sorry, Aahz," I said testily, "but I don't believe it. I've taken a lot of things you've told me on faith, but this goes against common sense." "What does common sense have to do with it?" he exploded. "We're talking about a job interview." At this outburst, Buttercup snorted and tossed his head, making it necessary for us to duck out of range of his horn. "Steady, Buttercup," I admonished soothingly. Though he still rolled his eyes, the unicorn resumed his stoic plodding, the travois loaded with our equipment dragging along behind him, still intact. Despite incidents such as had occurred back at the inn, Buttercup and I got along fairly well, and he usually obeyed me. In contrast, he and Aahz never really hit it off, especially when the latter chose to raise his voice angrily. "All it takes is a little gentleness," I informed Aahz smugly. "You should try it sometime." "While you're showing off your dubious rapport with animals," Aahz retorted, "you might call your dragon back. All we need is to have him stirring up the countryside." I cast a quick glance about. He was right. Gleep had disappeared. Again. "Gleep!" I called. "Come here, fella!" "Gleep!" came an answering cry. The bushes off to our left parted, and the dragon's head emerged. "Gleep!" he said, cocking his head. "Come here," I repeated. My pet needed no more encouragement. He bounded into the open and trotted to my side. "I still say we should have left that stupid dragon back at the inn," Aahz grumbled. I ignored him, checking to be sure that the gear, hung saddlebag fashion over the dragon's back, was still secure. Personally, I felt we were carrying far too much in the way of personal belongings, but Aahz had insisted. Gleep tried to nuzzle me affectionately with his head, and I caught a whiff of his breath. For a moment, I wondered if Aahz had been right about leaving the dragon behind. "What were you saying about job interviews?" I asked, both to change the subject and to hide the fact I was gagging. "I know it sounds ridiculous, kid," Aahz began with sudden sincerity, "and it is, but a lot of things are ridiculous, particularly in this dimension. That doesn't mean we don't have to deal with them." That gave me pause to think. To a lot of people, having a demon and a dragon for traveling companions would seem ridiculous. As a matter of fact, if I took time to think it through, it seemed pretty ridiculous to me. "Okay, Aahz," I said finally. "I can accept the existence of ridiculousness as reality. Now, try explaining the court magician thing to me again." We resumed walking as Aahz organized his thoughts. For a change, Gleep trailed placidly along beside Buttercup instead of taking off on another of his exploratory side trips. "See if this makes any sense," Aahz said finally. "Court magicians don't do much, magically at least. They're primarily kept around for show, as a status symbol to demonstrate a court is advanced enough to rate a magician. It's a rare occasion when they're called upon to do anything. If you were a jester, they'd work your tail off, but not as a magician. Remember, most people are skittish about magic and use it as seldom as possible." "If that's the case," I said confidently, "I'm qualified. I'll match my ability to do nothing against any magician on Claw." "No argument there," Aahz observed dryly, "but it's not quite that easy. To hold the job takes next to no effort at all. Getting the job can be an uphill struggle." "Oh," I said, mollified. "Now to get the job, you'll have to impress the king and probably his advisors," Aahz continued. "You'll have to impress them with you, not with your abilities." "How's that again?" I frowned. "Look, kid, like I said, a court magician is window dressing, a showpiece. They'll be looking for someone they want to have hanging around their court, someone who's impressive whether or not he ever does anything. You'll have to exude confidence. Most important, you'll have to look like a magician, or at least what they think a magician looks like. If you can dress like a magician, talk like a magician, and act like a magician, maybe no one will notice you don't have the abilities of a magician." "Thanks, Aahz," I grimaced. "You're really doing wonders toward building my confidence." "Now, don't sulk," Aahz admonished. "You know how to levitate reasonably large objects. You can fly, after a fashion, and you've got the disguise spell down pat. You're doing pretty well for a rank novice, but don't kid yourself into believing you're anywhere near full magician status." He was right, of course, but I was loath to admit it. "If I'm such a bumbling incompetent," I said stiffly, "why are we on our way to establish me as a court magician?" Aahz bared his teeth at me in irritation. "You aren't listening, kid," he snarled. "Holding the job once you've got it will be a breeze. You can handle that now. The tricky part will be getting you hired. Fortunately, with a few minor modifications and a little coaching, I think we can get you ready for polite society." "Modifications such as what?" I asked, curious despite myself. Aahz made a big show of surveying me from head to foot. "For a start," he said, "there's the way you dress." "What's wrong with the way I dress?" I countered defensively. "Nothing at all," he replied innocently. "That is, if you want people to see you as a bumpkin peasant with dung on his boots. Of course, if you want to be a court magician, well, that's another story. No respectable magician would be caught dead in an outfit like that." But I am a respectable magician, I argued. Really? Respected by who? He had me there, so I lapsed into silence. That's specifically the reason I had the foresight to bring along a few items from the inn, Aahz continued, indicating Buttercup's burdens with a grand sweep of his hand. And here I thought you were just looting the place, I said dryly. Watch your mouth, kid, he warned. This is all for your benefit. Really? You aren't expecting anything at all out of this deal? My sarcasm, as usual, was lost on him. Oh, I'll be around, he acknowledged. Don't worry about that. Publicly, I'll be your apprentice. My apprentice? This job was suddenly sounding much better. Publicly, Aahz repeated hastily. Privately, you'll continue your lessons as normal. Remember that before you start getting frisky with your apprentice. Of course, Aahz, I assured him. Now, what was it you were saying about changing the way I dress? He shot me a sidelong glance, apparently suspicious of my sudden enthusiasm. Not that there's anything wrong with me the way I am, I added with a theatrical scowl. That seemed to ease his doubts. Everything's wrong with the way you dress, he growled. We're lucky those two imps left most of their wardrobe behind when we sent them packing along with Istvan. Higgins and Brockhurst? Yeah, those two. Aahz grinned evilly at the memory. I'll say one thing for imps. They may be inferior to Deville's as merchants, but they are snappy dressers. I find it hard to believe that all that stuff you bundled along is wardrobe, I observed skeptically. Of course it isn't, my mentor moaned. It's special effects gear. Special effects? Don't you remember anything, kid? Aahz scowled. I told you all this when we first met. However easy magic is, you can't let it look easy. You need a few hand props, a line of patter, you know, like Garkin had. Garkin's hut, where I had first been introduced to magic, had been full of candles, vials of strange powders, dusty books. Now there was a magician's lair. Of course, I had since discovered most of what he had was unnecessary for the actual working of magic itself. I was beginning to see what Aahz meant when he said I'd have to learn to put on a show. We've got a lot of stuff we can work into your presentation, Aahz continued. Istvan left a lot of his junk behind when he left. Oh, and you might find some familiar items when we unload. I think the imps helped themselves to some of Garkin's equipment and brought it back to the inn with them. Really? I said, genuinely interested. Did they get Garkin's brazier? Brazier? My mentor frowned. You remember, I prompted. You used it to drink wine out of when you first arrived. That's right. Yeah, I think I saw it in there. Why? No special reason, I replied innocently. It was always a favorite of mine, that's all. From watching Garkin back in my early apprentice days, I knew there were secrets to that brazier I was dying to learn. I also knew that, if possible, I wanted to save it as a surprise for Aahz. We're going to have to do something about your physical appearance, too, Aahz continued thoughtfully. You're too young, he answered, anticipating my question. Nobody hires a young magician. They want one who's been around for a while. If we... He broke off suddenly and craned his neck to look around. Kid, he said carefully, studying the sky. Your dragon's gone again. I did a fast scan. He was right. Gleep, I called. Here, fella. The dragon's head appeared from the depths of a bush behind us. There was something slimy with legs dangling from his mouth, but before I could manage an exact identification, my pet swallowed, and the what's-it disappeared.
Gleep,
he said proudly, licking his lips with his long forked tongue. Stupid dragon, Aahz muttered darkly. He's cheap to feed, I countered, playing on what I knew to be Aahz's tight-fisted nature. As we waited for the dragon to catch up, I had time to reflect that for once I felt no moral or ethical qualms about taking part in one of Aahz's schemes. If the unsuspecting Roderick V was taken in by our charade and hired us, I was confident the king would be getting more than he bargained for.